Chuck Morse, host of Left Right Radio. My guest is Charles Derber. He's a professor of sociology at Boston College. He's the author of really a long list of distinguished books, including Corporation Nation, Regime Change Begins at Home, Hidden Power, and many other books. I don't even know where to start. Charles, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for inviting me, Chuck.
You know, Charles, when I first invited you on, I was going to talk about where, and we can still get into that, where the progressive movement is and now in the age of Trump and, with the, sort of the horse race type of political talk about the upcoming midterm election. But then I saw you delivering a talk at a seminar where you bemoaned the fact that the New York Times and even as, CNN, as you put it, do not talk about a fundamental question, which is why do we need capitalism? And should we get rid of capitalism? And that gets into one of the topics that I like to focus on, which is what is left and what is right in politics and in culture. So why don't we start with your defining what you mean by capitalism and what you consider to be an appropriate alternative to capitalism if capitalism was gotten rid of?
So that comment, I made that comment not in a seminar, but an interview with Christopher Hedges, who runs that Hedges, I think many of the people who might be to us. And so Hedges, I did an interview that's gotten thousands and thousands of views, which is called The Failings of the American Left. And that was titled by Hedges, but he caught on to the same phrase that you did. And I made the comment that there was not a left that, as we have historically understood the left in the United States. I actually wrote a book called What's Left back about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But historically, the left has been a movement which essentially raises the question you say, which is not being discussed on CNN or in the Democratic Party or even on college campuses in classes, college political science or economic classes these days, which is why aren't we talking about capitalism, and is there a viable alternative? So in my view, the discussion, a national conversation about capitalism disappeared at the end of the 1960s, when you were at the end of a period where a very significant amount of upheaval around civil rights and around the Vietnam War and feminism and so forth led to some fairly fundamental poverty. Martin Luther King was beginning a war on poverty, had joined a strike by sanitation workers. And there was beginning to be a sense of what I call in this most recent book, which is called Welcome to the Revolution. It's about what I call universalizing resistance. I argue that there is no left as we've historically understood in the United States because we have no national conversation about capitalism. So what I mean by capitalism is an economic system in which people are essentially divided primarily by the question of what kind of capital they control. And in a capitalist system, the defining quality is that it's a profit-driven system in which a very small percentage of the people own most of the capital necessary to run the economy and guide the political system. And most people are vulnerable. They're basically structurally dependent for their survival because they don't have the capital, land, or money to create their own work. So capitalism is a highly structurally, institutionally polarized society between people who control wealth and thereby power, political power, and people who are constantly vulnerable to the whims of people who do have that power. Now, at the end of the 60s, I think we were moving toward a serious debate about capitalism, which I want to add did happen in Europe in the 20th century and helps explain why Europe has ended up with forms of capitalist or social democratic systems which are closer to what I would call at least the first step toward a viable alternative to capitalism. So when Bernie Sanders talked about democratic socialism, the first most widely Googled word after that debate that he had with Hillary Clinton was socialism. And hundreds of thousands of people Googled the word socialism. And it was a reflection, I think, of the fact that Bernie Sanders was the first guy in the sort of in a mainstream political venue to essentially raise the problematic of capitalism itself, sort of suggesting there's something fundamentally wrong with the national conversation in the United States, because we're not talking about the most important word and system that defines our life and that has a lot to do with explaining war and climate change and racism and so forth. And so I inserted that in a conversation with Chris Hedges, which people can find on YouTube. And as I said, it's called The Failings of the American Left. And what I meant by that is that after the 60s, the left's historical focus, as we saw in Europe and to some degree in the New Deal and in the Gilded Age, in the robber baron period, where the populist left first emerged, and there was a kind of Occupy Wall Street movement in the 1890s, where basically the populist party and the people called the People's Party, which was developed in 1892 and sort of morphed into the Democratic Party, raised the question of why people should not control the banks and Wall Street and the biggest companies that were making the lives of most Americans impoverished. In 1890, 90% of Americans were poor, and John D. Rockefeller was the first billionaire, became the first billionaire American, and helped, along with J.P. Morgan and Carnegie, help create modern capitalism. We really established capitalism in that historical era. And that created a conversation that we found among some labor unions, the Wobblies, among the populists and so forth, about how do we think about this new system that's sort of taking root in America, and which is fundamentally changing the nature of our democratic life, because the robber barons, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Morgans and so forth were basically overtly using their amazing amount of money and corporate power to essentially dictate a new agenda for the country. Interesting, Teddy Roosevelt took note of this, and while he wasn't a populist, he embraced certain forms of progressivism. And, at one point he wanted to set up, this was in 1905, 1906, 1907, he wanted to set up what we called a Bureau of Corporations, which would be a new agency of the federal government that would allow the federal government to essentially construct a new roadmap for the economy and the country, in which corporations would be subject to a kind of regulation, constraint, and potentially public ownership of the kind that the populists had raised in the 1890s, which really gets to the question of what capitalism is all about and what might be a viable alternative, which is what you asked me about. Right. I don't think we've had that conversation. Roosevelt was very close friends with J.P. Morgan. He didn't want to take that conversation too far. He was not a socialist. He was not really challenging capitalism per se, but he was challenging the unfettered, wild kind of Wild West cowboy capitalism that had been established in the Gilded Age by the robber barons in the 1890s. Since that period, to just run through American history in like 2 seconds, we had in the New Deal another conversation that verged on talking about the nature of capitalism, because capitalism had collapsed. We had the Great Depression. 1 out of every 3 Americans were unemployed. Franklin Roosevelt also did not want to undermine capitalism. He said it was trying to save capitalism for itself, taking his guidance from the great economist John Maynard Keynes. But there were many communists and let's call anti-capitalists who were busy organizing people from being thrown out of their homes, from doing wildcat strikes, and thinking about ways to organize the economy and the political system in a way that ordinary people could really have some level of control over the direction of the country rather than simply the big corporations. I wrote a book, which I think you referred to, called Regime Change Begins at Home. And what I was talking about is that American history is a sequence of regimes. Regimes are they're all capitalist in America, but they're configurations of institutional power where different institutional discourses and forms of power and hierarchies come into power and change the direction of the country. So in the 1920s, we had a corporate-driven regime, which was full-scale, corporate dominance and, totally oriented toward financial speculation and profit and led to the collapse of 1929. That collapse led to the Depression and led to a regime change inside the United States that led to a new regime, which was the New Deal regime, which was, came close to be at least talking about what capitalism is and why we need to think and talk more about, if we're going to live in a capitalist society, how do we avoid depressions and how do we avoid massive amounts of suffering on the parts of working people? And that discourse never became an alternative to capitalism, but it raised important questions about power in capitalist societies and how ordinary workers and ordinary people could live a decent life in the kind of society we have. Now, in the 60s, that was still part of the New Deal era. And you went to the edge of the cliff. You went to a point where the society, following people like Martin Luther King, who in many ways was not very revolutionary, but had come over the course of his life and of his activism to realize that racism, the civil rights movement, and the anti-war movement could not be understood or changed without thinking about the economic system and without thinking about labor and capitalism. So at the end of his life, and he knew he was going to be shot when he raised this question, he began connecting the dots between these different forms of struggle in America, for example, around civil rights, around feminism, around poverty, around Vietnam and militarism and so forth. By bringing those things together, King was engaged in what I call, and this is the subject of this book I'm talking about called Welcome to the Revolution, the subject of a universalizing resistance movement is to put back on the table the conversations we've not been having on CNN or even on the left or even in the New York Times or the Democratic Party about how to understand the problems in our society systemically and how to connect the dots so that each of these struggles that we look at, whether it's about race, whether it's about guns, whether it's about women, and all these resistance movements that we're seeing emerge today, trying to contextualize them and connect the dots in a way that King eventually did. And which leads you back to where you asked me about, which leads you ultimately, in my judgment, to a conversation about political economy, about the economic and political systems and the nature of capitalism. Now, in my view, capitalism means talking not just about, the economy and about the power of people who hold massive sway over large banks and corporations on a global basis. But it also means talking about universities, means talking about media and how media is controlled, the conversation we have on the media. It's about talking about race and gender. And so my hope is that we're on the cusp of, particularly because Trump it's not that Trump is so different than the Republican Party or parts of the Democratic Party. It's just that he's so psychologically and personally outrageous and extreme in his way of presenting things that he's opened up a realm of discourse. I ought to say also that he won the election partly because he was pointing to some of the vulnerabilities of the population under a pretty raw capitalist system, which was the forgotten people in Pennsylvania that we just saw vote the other day, and the people in Wisconsin and Ohio who helped elect him, he was putting his finger on an issue that had been largely abandoned both by Clintons and the Democratic Party, who sort of hitched their stars to Wall Street in the 1990s and basically abandoned the New Deal discourse and went into the Reagan regime, which was a regime that was purely capitalist and didn't allow regimes define conversation and discourse, the terms of respectable discourse. Under the Reagan, what I call the third corporate regime, the first was the Gilded Age, the second was the 1920s. The third was started by the Reagan Revolution. And that corporate regime, one of the first things it does, it takes off the table certain conversational topics, and one is capitalism. And so I think what Bernie Sanders did and what Trump has inadvertently and unwittingly done is perhaps open up that conversation to a wider set of issues so that you've got Black Lives Matter people talking about socialism. You've got environmentalists like Naomi Klein talking about, or Bill McKibben, talking about the relationship now between the economy and the environment and the future of humanity and whether we're going to survive. So I think the beginning of a new conversation about capitalism is central to both immediate politics that we're going through right now in the Trump era, and also to a longer term reorientation of our politics. So we start talking about really serious issues.
Well, I mean, I don't know where to start. You're truly a professor in that you answer a question that takes 15 minutes. But there's a lot of interesting things there, some of which I actually find that I agree with. One of the comments that sticks out to me is this idea that every regime, as you call it, which I don't think you're talking about a specific government, you're talking about a political zeitgeist at a given period of time, is basically to varying degrees capitalist in American history. I think that that's true. I think America, our society, even in colonial times, was founded on capitalist principles, going all the way back to when the first pilgrims, the first settlers, rejected what Governor William Bradford referred to as a communistic experiment, because they were all on the verge of starvation. And he realized that the only way to proceed was to allow for a division of property and for people to achieve capital based upon their labor. Then the colony thrived and they had Thanksgiving. But the point that I see is that the country is a capitalist country not because of the big corporations, which you and I might find agreement on, but because we're a nation of farmers, small businessmen, individual property owners, people who at various levels have taken control of their own destiny to the degree that we can, and their own futures by means of creating lives for themselves. It's always been a nation of individual striving and of lifting oneself up from one's bootstraps. And in that sense, we are very different from other societies. And I think that the capitalist aspect of America is the aspect that most accurately reflects the very best and the very worst elements of human nature. We are self-interested beings. We want to control our own destiny to the degree that the good Lord gives us the ability to do so, given the vicissitudes of nature, which prevent that, of course. And we want to be able to do it on our own terms as sovereign individual citizens who are not answerable to the state, but who are answerable to God. As Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, we're endowed by the Creator. He didn't say we're endowed by the state. And that rights, as he saw them, were inalienable, that they are in nature. Things like private ownership of property, that's something that is in nature. I mean, animals understand that. Try to violate the property of a dog and see what happens. Try to violate the property of a bird's nest. This is something it's kind of part of who we are. It's in our genes, I guess, or it's who we are. And that capitalism as a system reflects that in the most accurate way possible, with all of its faults. The other thing that I think is natural to human beings.
Just briefly, because I want to take issue with something you're saying, which is important, which is that I think what you're talking about when you talk about capitalism providing the foundation for individuals to take control of their own destiny and to individually make their own destiny. What you're talking about is not the reality of capitalism, but the ideology of capitalism.
Wait, let me just interrupt, if I don't mind. I don't view capitalism is not an ideology. Capitalism is a reflection of human nature. And the other aspect, besides...
What I'm trying to say is that in capitalism...
Charles, let me just speak here, because you have 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Because I want to make a point here. Besides the element of private ownership, of self-interest, which is what gets every individual up in the morning and which is part of who we are, and which capitalism creates a stage by which that can exist, there's also the element of individuals wanting to do good for other people. That's natural to us. Now, that doesn't mean that every person out there is going to do good for other people. A lot of people don't. But the point is, it is a natural tendency that is part of the human being, the part of the human psyche, the part of the human soul that wants to help our fellow man, which is why America, as a capitalist country, is the most generous of countries. And the American people are the most do better for people who have less than them, not with the government help, not with government enforcing it, which is what socialism is, but because it's a natural tendency in people to do good for other people, to make the world a better place. You know, in Judaism, they call it tikkun olam, to leave a bigger footprint in the world. And that's natural to people. That's what religions teach. We don't need to have government, in a sense, enforce that and to do it using authoritarian means. It actually doesn't work, as we can point to examples of history. Now, as far as corporations are concerned, what you're talking about is something that I think conservatives and liberals probably agree, in that when you have high concentrations of wealth on an international level, there's a tendency toward authoritarianism. There's a tendency toward getting into bed with the government. You mentioned that Theodore Roosevelt wanted to have a council of corporations. Well, that was eventually done by Mussolini. That's called fascism. I mean, that's when you have a merge between private ownership and Bolshevism. You know, it's a shift to the left. It's a massive kind of, Mussolini recognized that Italy was not ready for Bolshevism because he was a Bolshevik professor in the 19 teens and 20s. So he came up with what he called the third way. Italy was still a country that had small ownership and then people liked their little businesses. It was also a country that still had a lot of influence from the Catholic Church. So he came up with a system by which corporations would become a part of the government. They would be in bed with the government. They would have political power, as opposed to a capitalist system where they wouldn't. Well, they could influence things, but they wouldn't have formal policy-making powers. And thus, he moved the country in a socialistic direction. And I think that what we're seeing in this country, to a certain degree, is that same tendency, where you have the big corporations, most of which are left-leaning, I'd point out, kind of influencing and getting into the halls of government. You see a revolving door in government between the big corporations, the big banks, some of the private trading banks like Goldman Sachs, and successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, I point out. And this is an unhealthy trend. This is something where I think conservatives and liberals agree, even though we may come at it from a different philosophical perspective.
Okay. So that was the longest discourse from an interviewer I've ever heard in my thousands of interviewers.
Yeah, but it was 5 minutes less than yours, so that's what we're doing, I guess. Okay. Anyways, go on.
We're having a conversation. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you.
So I want to come back to what I was concerned about, what you were saying before. I agree with much of what you said at the end about corporations getting more and more influence as wealth is concentrated. What I wanted to challenge, Chuck, was your idea that that capitalism as a system is a system that encourages and permits individuals to take charge of their own fate, both economically, to try to become the best person they can. And when I said that was ideology, what I was trying to say is the reality of almost every capitalist society is that, and that this is in fact why Marx, the first major full-fledged systemic critic of capitalism, opposed it. He said that he believed, like you do, and Noam Chomsky, for example, if you read his Political Economy, also agrees with you, that human nature is oriented toward two things. One, the desire to express your own needs and your own creativity and your own views as fully as possible, have the kind of autonomy that you talked about, and to also be able to express a form of solidarity or to do well with other people that you also mentioned. So I don't think we agree. I think that human nature does have these dual things. But where I disagree with what you're saying, and where Marx, the whole reason that Marx and the left in general have been critical of capitalism is that when we look historically at the reality of capitalism, it is that while it may start out with people being on small farms and many small business people and so forth, being able in the market to be competitive and express their own, initiative and to be entrepreneurs and so forth, as capitalism evolves historically, it moves from what many people have called the competitive stage of capitalism to the monopoly stage of capitalism. The monopoly stage of capitalism, a very important book, was written in the 1950s called Monopoly Capitalism by Sweezy and Baran, who are two economists. And they argue that if you look at in the mid-20th century, the model of capitalism you are describing, of individuals, being able to, gather a little capital, start their businesses, having a small business, chart their own destiny, is yielding and surrendering to what is almost historically the inevitable trajectory of capitalism, which is toward an enormous concentration of wealth. Big companies, the nature of capitalist competition is that larger companies who are more successful gobble up smaller companies. And then those larger companies, and we now have situations where most CEOs say they won't even compete in markets where there are more than 2 or 3 players. You have oligopolistic or monopolistic markets. So what I was trying to say is that I think capitalism survives in the United States because it holds up this ideal, which is very attractive that you described, that people are free to pursue their own destiny, to develop their own creative powers, and to flourish based on their own efforts and talents. But the reality is that as capitalism develops historically, it does offer some of these things that you're describing, but it cuts off as it develops, particularly in places like the United States. It undermines the very thing that you like about capitalism, the ability for people to express themselves. The market becomes more controlled. It becomes more controlled by corporations melding with the state, larger corporations control.
I mean, that's the very point I'm making. And that, in a sense, you're talking about a capitalism that moves away from the principles of capitalism and more toward authoritarianism, more toward the nanny state, where you have, corporations working with the government to control what people do. It controls and wants to control people's health, wants to control education, wants to control welfare, wants to centralize powers, which I would argue is a move toward the authoritarian left. But as far as wealth itself is concerned and capital, I don't have a problem with people becoming super rich. I think that's great. Look at, the incredible things that they do. We could give examples in recent history of people like Bill Gates or the late Steve Jobs. I mean, they harnessed a technology that was there anyway, but they were able to take the powers of that technology and market it in such a way that it made it available to millions of people all over the world. And in the process, not only did they make themselves very rich, but they made tens of thousands of people at various levels rich, all the way down to the guy who works as a clerk in an Apple store. I mean, they created entities, they created opportunities when nothing had existed before. And this gets into, maybe it's a little beyond what we can talk about today, but it gets into the nature of capital, which is maybe too big a subject. But the left tends to view capital as a commodity that is finite and needs to be redistributed. I would argue that in a capitalist sense, in a more conservative sense, capital is just a reflection of the human imagination. It's infinite. It's the ability of the human imagination, the human being to invent, to create, to manufacture. And the more invention and the more freedom you have, which results in such invention, the more capital is created to back and to support that freedom. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they created capital. They created money. The Federal Reserve had to turn on the printing press to keep up with them. They actually created money where it didn't exist because you needed more money in order to carry their businesses and their endeavors all over the world. And it became something that made society richer. Now, as far as monopoly goes, I agree with you, and I agreed with the Teddy Roosevelt model where you had trust busting. I think that at this point, things like Google and our good friend at Facebook, which is, by the way, the company that's allowing us to do this right now, and Apple, these companies probably should be busted. They should be like Standard Oil was busted into 7 pieces. It's too much power in the hands of one company, and that the manifestation of that is now becoming apparent as there is evidence, and I can't cite hard evidence, but there's a growing suspicion, let's put it that way, that Facebook and that Google, that they are involving themselves in censoring particularly conservative points of view. And that's where they are, in a sense, taking on governmental powers because of their position as a private company. So I think that, there's no such thing as this unfettered capitalism. That's as false a concept as communism is. There can never be such a thing. It's against human nature. Capitalism is something that has to exist within a context of people who elect representatives regulating businesses, and also in a spiritual context, in a context of a set of moral and ethical standards that we view as having come from a divine, or even if you're an atheist, you could view it as coming from nature. But however it comes about, it tends to temper capitalist tendencies in the same way that it tempers our individual tendencies toward excess.
So I would say that your view of the evolution of capitalism and to its sort of essence, which is this individual creative expression, millions of Bill Gates entrepreneurs who become liberators for humanity, is kind of an illusion. It's a kind of incredibly. In fact, I think Trump became powerful because the illusion has so much power to sort of. I know in Brockton, you and I are both talking in Boston. You go to a school, black school down in a grammar school in Boston. You ask about kids who are poor, what they expect to do when they're like 25 years old. They say, "Oh, we're going to be fantastically rich. We are going to be in control of our lives. We are going to live a fully creative and controlling life." And so this is an image of appealing to people's belief in the American dream, getting ahead, and so forth, that holds capitalism up. And it's very powerful because it speaks to people's self.
I think that it's...
Hey, let me just speak, because you've been speaking for most of this interview. If you want me to talk to you, let me talk for just a little bit.
Please.
My view is that the essence of capitalism is to essentially concentrate these powers of imagination and power, over political systems and life in general in smaller and smaller numbers of hands. And that's why we have a system in which most people today in America, we have the lowest voting rate in the advanced world. We have healthcare systems that don't, unlike any other developed country, that don't cover most people in the society, where we have, an environmental collapse that is looming on the edge, where we're dealing with billions and billions of dollars going into, military endeavors that are oriented toward maintaining safe environments for companies to invest in around the world. We have a huge amount of things. We're running out of time historically. This is no joke. Capitalism, the essence of capitalism is to concentrate power. The very things I think you and I share, if this is a left-right dialogue, which I guess it is, a belief in human freedom and in the ability of people to express themselves creatively and to take control of their own lives, with a strong emphasis on social solidarity and doing well by other people, healing the world, healing our communities, and so forth. But where we differ is that I think you see that the historical trajectory and essence of capitalism is to make that reality come true. And my view is that if you take away your wishes and your political, and you simply look historically, that every capitalist society we see that is not subjected to enormous amounts of public accountability, it becomes the exact opposite of what you're looking for. It does not become a society. And the United States is a perfect example of that. The great majority of people, 50% of Americans, have no money to save. They live day by day. They're worried about the next illness they have in their family. They worry about, let's say you're right, that it doesn't matter how much money people individually have. Although, the fact that Bill Gates has more money than all the people in Africa put together, and that there are about 20 billionaires that have more money than 90% of the American population. But let's just think about the people who don't have money. Let's give the rich people, most people of those rich people, a lot of them inherited it. If Donald Trump had just taken the money he was left by his father and put it in the bank at 3%, he would have more money than we think he has now. Most wealthy people are born into wealth. We don't have the mobility. European, more socially societies have more social mobility today. We have good data on this than the United States does. When Thomas Piketty, the French economist, published his book on inequality and capitalism, which you probably know, it's the definitive work. It covers 3 centuries and 30 countries, the first empirical study where we have some actual data. We know that the history of capitalism is constantly to increase the number of people who are essentially left out, what Trump called forgotten people, people who are not able to express the very freedom that you think capitalism offers. The historical data contradicts your vision. And read Piketty, it's 900 pages. It lays out, I wrote a book which is about Piketty, which is sort of a Reader's Digest version of Piketty. To essentially, what he says is that while he doesn't have a complete theory, what he says is that the return on capital is always greater than the return on labor for many, many reasons. So, for example, but what it means is that except in the mid-20th century in the United States, which was a huge exception during the New Deal period, the trajectory over 30 countries, and you look at the distribution of wealth and the distribution of political power in capitalism, it's always in the same direction. And read Piketty and you'll find data, hard data, not what you want or what I want, but hard data to document this historical trajectory of capitalism. So you and I want the same things. We want everybody to be able to express their own individual freedom, to have control over their own destiny, and to have a kind of, tikkun olam, a kind of healing of the birth and a healing of each other as part of that destiny that we all seek. Where we differ is our historical understanding of what capitalism has actually produced. And when you look at that, and when you look at the data that's available, you find that it does not reinforce, it doesn't reinforce Marx. I agree with you. It shows that wealth can create more wealth and that it can be distributed broadly to more people than Marx ever thought possible. After all, he expected a revolution in 1848 that would end capitalism almost before it began. But the reality is that he was, while he was very wrong about some of this stuff, he was very right that capitalism would lead in the direction that Piketty documents, toward more and more concentration of wealth, more and more concentration of political power, and the great majority of people losing the very thing you believe in, Chuck, which is the ability of individuals to have control over their own economic and social and political destiny. That's gone. Americans feel hopeless about it. Americans are dying. The life expectancy of Americans is being reduced for the first time in history. Younger Americans, your children, you have one child, your child is going to live less well in all likelihood than you. This is the pattern of American history.
We could argue about why that is. I would suggest that it has to do with with the fact that we pay up to 40% of our income in taxes, that we're not actually able to keep our property until June of any given year, and that the money is transferred to the control of government. But one of the things I would take issue with you here is that I do think that it is perfectly fine for a young Black student in an inner city school to dream about being rich and successful. I think that it doesn't mean that they're going to make it that far.
They're not.
They may or they may not. A lot of them might.
Look, you got to look at it.
Let me finish my thought here.
What percentage of Black students are going to become rich?
Increasing numbers, actually, in a free system. But the point I'm making here is that, like, for example, when I was a kid, I dreamed of being a baseball player like Carl Yastrzemski. I don't know if you remember who Carl Yastrzemski.
Of course I do.
Okay. But I could not do that because I don't have the physical attributes. I don't have the ability to go through whatever he went through to make him do what he did. That doesn't mean that I'm, disappointed. Whatever it was that made me strive for that, made me a better person. It put me in a direction of perhaps finding a path that would work for me. Doesn't mean I'm going to be as successful or not. But the fact that somebody wants to be that super successful is going to be a motivating factor for them to possibly, hopefully, improve their life. Not everybody is going to become that super successful. And I don't know what the Thomas Piketty's work is. I have not read it. I don't know how. I very probably will at this point, now that you've talked about it, or at least I'll read in it. And I'm not sure exactly how he defines capitalism. But what I would suggest is that, putting aside his work, which may contradict this, the American system has been one which has allowed for greater upward mobility and downward mobility for people. And when I say downward,
we have very good recent data on social mobility rates all across the whole spectrum of developed countries in Europe and the United States. The United States is way down. It's true that the United States
we've gotten away from our original ideals. Now we're paying 40% of our income in taxes. Oh. We've got a big, since the 1920s and since the advent of the Wilsonian nanny state.
Higher tax rates in all these European countries, much higher tax rates, and they have much higher social mobility. You can't keep contradicting.
I'm going to take your word for that, Charles. I'd have to take a look at that. I don't know. I mean, is there greater mobility?
Rates are higher in Europe, and you also
upward mobility in France than there is in the United States.
France and Scandinavia all have higher wages. The ability of people to live these individual dreams out in these countries are much higher. Why? Because they're protected with basic health care and basic needs so that they can dream these larger things and really believe it. The kids in Brockton, great. It's great for them to do it, but 95% of them are going to end up poor. We know this. We have data on how many kids in Brockton are able to go out. It's great to encourage dreams, but not if you don't have the infrastructure around them. What Europe has done.
You and I could debate on what would constitute that infrastructure.
Public expenditures. It's created the infrastructure, which gives people a realistic hope of dreaming. You've got social mobility. The American dream has moved to Europe because those people actually have real social mobility. What Piketty's data shows, and this is not just Piketty, it's a whole class. You should read the stratification analysis, which looks at the whole studies of social mobility and how much people, if you take quintiles in America, the lowest quintile is the lowest 20%, the next is the next 20%, and so forth, all to the top 20%. What you see is this dramatic shift in mobility. If you're born into the second quintile, the second lowest quintile, your probability of ending your life in that second quintile currently in America is very, very high. The probability that you would move one quintile up or down is almost everything. You're either going to be where you were born or one quintile up or down. Now in Europe, you're getting a much greater shift across quintiles. And I'm not giving you bullshit here. I'm giving you actual data. And
well, look, you might be right as far as, for example, Eastern Europe is concerned, Poland.
No, I'm talking about France, Germany.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know about that, but I think in Eastern Europe, those are countries that were suffering under the yoke of leftist socialism for a generation, and now that they're freer, there's a huge energy toward upward mobility there. But they're coming from a place that is so much different than our long-term growth. You know, these are countries that suffered. I mean, it's like Cuba or North Korea or some other socialist paradise. They're countries that are desperately poor, where suddenly in those cases, they have freedom thrust upon them because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they're beginning to, there's energy, there's thriving, but they're coming from a very poor place. So as far as nationalized healthcare goes, I think that's another subject for another day. I would take major issue with you on that, only in that if you have a system where there's rationing and where there's death panels that decide whether or not you have a Quarry score, that means your life is worth living, and which they don't count the number of people who didn't get health care because they're dead, you know, like they have in Britain and Canada. I mean, in Canada, the system was so bad that
you're ignoring data.
The Canadian Supreme Court actually stepped in and had to throw out large pieces of that socialized system.
Quality of healthcare. You're just not listening to data. France has the country which across
I'll see your data and I'll raise your data.
Across the board,
yeah,
health professionals and governments and people who study the quality of health in a country rate these European countries as by far the best healthcare in the world. If you look at life expectancy and rates of illness in Europe versus the United States on these issues, there's no question. The United States spends 5 times as much on healthcare.
We don't. I don't want to get too much off on a tangent on healthcare. We'd have to see those statistics again. I would suggest to you gently that the British healthcare system, for example, they don't count the people who have died because they were waiting for their turn, or because the amount of healthcare was cut back because of their age or health. And, as imperfect as our system is, which it's very imperfect because capitalism as an idea is imperfect, it reflects the imperfect nature of human beings, you at least have a chance. Like if you go to a hospital, I would rather have a private insurance company that I can tell the hospital to go to than if it's the state deciding whether or not I'm going to get a certain amount of health care. Why don't we just leave it at that? It's a big subject. Maybe you and I can do another program on that, but we're getting toward the end of the broadcast, so we can tackle healthcare perhaps another time, I guess. I want to get back to the basic definitions that we started with, because we started on your comment where you said that you thought that we should be having a public discussion, and I agree, about capitalism and its alternatives. I would suggest that the alternatives to capitalism are chilling to me, and there's a reason why they have never taken hold in the United States. It's not consistent with the American ethos at any and all levels. We don't like that kind of authoritarian nanny state approach. Generally, Americans, rich, poor, or otherwise, would rather have a degree of individual sovereignty. They would rather consider rights as coming from God as opposed to the state. And where I see that we agree is the business of breaking up these big corporations. But I want to ask you, why is it in general, and again, I'm generalizing, and I suppose you have to, that the richest Americans, if you take a look, for example, at Forbes magazine every year publishes a list of the 100 richest Americans. They get the information from tax returns, from other sources. If you take a look at the names on that list, and if you take a look at the cultures of America's top corporations, the biggest corporations like Microsoft, like Google, like Facebook, which is nice enough to host this show, like Costco, like Amazon, these people tend to be left of center. They tend to support liberal left candidates for office. They tend to support liberal causes. You have to start going down the list before you get to more conservative people. In fact, if you look at the top 10 richest people in this country, there's only 2 on that list that are not liberals. And they're not necessarily conservative either. I would say they're more libertarian. And those are Charles and David Koch. And that's it. And look at the withering attack they're under. I mean, they're the only ones that
which is a trade association of gun companies, Remington. You look at coal.
I don't think conservative.
Look at the oil companies.
Vermont is the biggest gun state in the union.
Pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, what about them?
I don't
know if they're conservative.
It is interesting, though. Let me say something about this. The capitalism has progressive cosmopolitan tendencies because it's a globalizing system.
Okay.
So, there is a kind of cultural cosmopolitanism that requires that corporations think beyond parochial interest, beyond just national interest, because they're focused on global markets and global brands and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Right. And it takes more education to get into corporate. Education tends to liberalize people's views. We know that one of the most liberalizing features. So in societies which have large amounts of education, you tend to have more progressive political cultures and more conversations about capitalism. So I think you're right, Chuck, that corporations have a tendency to subvert some, particularly high-tech, knowledge-based capitalism, which is the direction we're going, is tendency, and it produces what's often called the professional managerial class, PMC. A sociologist named Alvin Gouldner wrote a book called The New Class, which is a very progressive class. It's a managerial class, and it works very often in tandem. It includes everybody from engineers to professors of sociology like myself and so forth. It's so diverse, but it brings a much liberal progressive critique to the society. But here's the thing. Capitalism in a sense is what I would call a form of national globalism, just like Hitler called his system National Socialism. Capitalism is it's a global system. It, by definition, is a system in which you seek to get, capital markets globalized and capital investments globalized toward presumably the most efficient, profitable areas where they can be, independent of national boundaries. But because that creates more and more wealth inequality, capitalism can only sustain itself by appealing to forms of nationalism, which are more parochial and, in the case of the United States, highly regressive. It can be racist. It can be
I reject that.
Very, very the kind of Trumpist bigotry that you see all the time.
I reject that.
But in any case, nationalism becomes the ideological counterweight to what you correctly saw as a kind of liberal cosmopolitanism of capitalism itself. And one of the interesting contradictions in capitalism is this cultural tension. I'm writing a book about this right now, between the sort of progressive cosmopolitan culture of capitalism and corporations and the nationalistic, regressive, atavistic, militaristic forms, which are used to draw workers back into identification with elites who don't really want to invest in them very much. So think about a set of houses. Each house is a country, but it really is part of a capitalist neighborhood, and the system operates as a neighborhood. But corporations, while they're invested in the neighborhood, understand that each of these houses has an upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs are the people who have a lot of money. The downstairs are the growing number of people who are just scraping by or not scraping by. How do you get the downstairs to identify and sustain the people on the upstairs? Well, you have to create a kind of nationalistic identity in the house, which says, if you're downstairs, it's more important that you identify with the people in the upstairs of your house than other people in downstairs in other countries, because that would provide a kind of global kind of worker or popular kind of alliance that would be threatening to the global system that is capitalist.
No, look, Charles, I think that, in fact, the opposite is true, in that it's the globalist liberal left that is atavistic and militaristic, that the idea of the nation state is a progressive idea. It's a democratic idea. It's an idea that also marries the concept.
But it's not a capitalist idea.
Let me finish my thought. It marries the very basic. It marries the very basic.
Corporations are global.
All right. It marries the very basic concept of subsidiarity, which is an inherent part of a capitalist ethos. It really was started by the Catholic Church. And that is that it's local government that is the most responsible to citizens, because that's where people are. That's, for example, the local school board should have a larger say in the education of our sons and daughters than a national entity or, God forbid, an international entity, because the local school board is more answerable to us. It's based upon a principle that's very much part of our founding principle, and that's very much natural and part of capitalism. And that is that we trust ourselves to govern ourselves. We don't need these globalist entities which are not accountable to people, and which are not democratic. Now, as far as
nationalism is global. There is nobody in the world, maybe other than you, but maybe all conservatives, everybody understands that capitalism we live in a global capitalist system.
Yeah, but that's your definition of capitalism, and that's
Bill Gates's definition. That's
definition. No, capitalism has to be tempered, and I started the conversation with this, Charles. Capitalism is tempered by the governments by which it operates and the interests of those governments, and also by moral standards. There's no such thing. The idea of unfettered capitalism, which controls the world, is as bad and as false as the idea of communism, which wants to turn the world into a one-world ant colony.
Well, I suggest you take this show
run against human nature.
Davos, Switzerland, and talk to the global capitalists who basically organize the global economic system, and bring your idea of capitalism to these people. And have you ever gone to Davos?
You'll find a lot of socialists over there, is what you'll find.
People who are running the world economy. And they are people.
They're socialistic and they're globalistic. And by the way,
they're the leading capitalists in the world.
Capitalism for them, but they're socialistic in that they want to control. And as I said, you look at the top richest people; they're left-leaning people.
They
want to have capitalism for the average working person to work their way up. They don't want to have. They use their power to tamper down on what is natural in a sovereign state, which is competition.
You're telling me that
that's by the way, the whole principle behind the Trump movement.
You're telling me, and there's a measure of truth to what you're saying. You're saying the people who run capitalism, the corporations, the biggest corporations, which are maybe 400 or 500 corporations that run much of the world, and the people who sit at the top of those corporations, you're saying they're socialists.
Yes, I am.
They're actually not capitalists. The people who run the capitalist system.
Socialists. They probably were capitalists as they worked their way up, but now that they've got power and they've got authority, they've forgotten how it is that they got there, and they've become world controller types. They've moved to the left. Now, the more progressive system is the one that you've been a little bit derisive toward, and that is the nation state, nationalism, which is a good concept. And then the American concept of nationalism is the most progressive concept I think that's ever been devised. And that is that we admire our country, but we criticize it. We dissent when it's wrong. We don't want to have the big government. We don't trust government. It was capsulized by Thomas Paine in his book Common Sense, which was published in 1776, when he referred to government as evil. That's the American conservative idea of nationalism, that we want to have a sovereign nation that serves us because we have sovereignty. Now, the left version of nationalism is hyper-nationalism, the nanny state of the National Socialists in Germany or the International Socialists in Russia, where the government controls everything. And maybe that's why the left is now so kind of sympathetic or leans towards Sharia, because that's a hyper-national system that controls everyone's lives.
The funny thing is, capitalism itself is built on globalism and the state. What is the state? When you talk about the nation state, well, Max Weber, the famous sociologist, has said the state is defined as the institution with a legal control over the uses of legal violence. Marx said the state is the executive committee of the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie. The state,
I reject that.
The nation state is essentially a product of the balances of power in a society, and has a lot to do with who in the society has the resources to take control of the government. If you look at the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they both get their money. If you look at the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, it's not just the Koch brothers. It's a whole range. It's Tom Steyer and the Democratic Party. The Clintons went to Wall Street. They got Bob Rubin from Citigroup. They've got all kinds of people from Wall Street running, pouring money into the Democratic Party.
All these liberals, yep.
So you find, if you're going to say that the biggest banks in the Wall Street and the biggest corporations in the world are socialist, you're inverting the concept. And if you're going to say that nationalism is a democratic project, nation state, and I'm a believer in subsidiarity, which is that the word you used earlier, that decisions should be made at levels that are commensurate with capable of solving the problems that you're dealing with. So, for example, if you're dealing with global climate change, you agree? Are you a believer in climate change?
I don't know. I know that air pollution is bad, and I think that
the temperature of the earth is.
Let me comment on that. I think that the approach to climate change, whether it be man-made or not, has been one that hasn't taken a single molecule of pollution out of the atmosphere. All it's done is shift wealth to the poor countries, more pollution into the atmosphere. The Rio Agreement, it allowed China and Brazil to pump even more pollution into the atmosphere. If you want to talk about reducing pollution, America has the best model.
Chuck, if you have a global problem, you need a global mechanism to deal with it. If you have a local problem, you need a local mechanism. I agree with you. The more you can drive decisions to the lowest level, commensurate with capability of solving the problem, is good. I'm a believer in subsidiarity, and I think so. We share that. What I'm just saying is there are many global issues that cannot be what you do in Austin, Brighton, or in Boston, what we do together in Boston, cannot solve a lot of crucial.
No, you know something. You're talking about environmental regulation. I would suggest that the best model for dealing with environmental problems like air pollution, which is what we're talking about, whether it's man-made, changing the climate or not, that's beside the point. The fact is we're talking about air pollution. And I would suggest that the best approach to that is local and state, not these big global plans, which do nothing but shift the air pollution to other countries and give them money. It's just a kind of a front for redistributing wealth. It doesn't do anything. Do you think that this international climate agreement would took a single molecule of pollution out of the atmosphere?
Well, we know what the levels of emission per capita of carbon are in every country of the world. And we know that the United States is the biggest per capita.
Because we're more industrialized. You have to take a look at that in a context. Well, look, if we allow people and we allow China to invent alternative fuels, then it'll improve that. But we are the most industrialized country in the world. So of course we have more pollution, but the actual emissions levels of our polluting instruments, which are necessary for our industrial growth, that's why you have a light on in your office right now, by the way, are actually lower because the people in this country want it to be lower. We're not spewing as much stuff into the atmosphere as some of the more developing countries that we're now telling that they can. I mean, this whole scheme about selling carbon stocks and all of that, that's just spreading it around and actually resulting in worse pollution in places like Beijing. And that's part of the world. You know, that's
back to capitalism. That's the thread, to the extent there's a coherent thread in this conversation. And one of my problems.
It's very coherent. Thank you.
One of the problems of capitalism is that environment, social and psychological and spiritual things that you're talking about are all externalities. Every economist, professional economist, will tell you that you know what an externality is, right? It's a cost or benefit, social or environmental cost or benefit that is not factored in to market calculation. So that if you have, for example, a pollution problem, this is a classic thing in economics, that you have an environmental externality, meaning that as long as the producer of the good doesn't have to pay for the cost to this, let's say the environment or to the health of the worker or whatever, that cost is an externality. So one of the great crises of capitalism is how do you internalize the externalities? We're facing, if you don't believe in climate change, whatever you want to call it, you know that there are environmental pollutions. You care about your daughter. You want her to have clean water, clean air, and so forth.
The answer is the free market.
And
it's because the American people don't want to have a dirty atmosphere. They're going to support modalities that are cleaner, and they're going to reject those which are not.
You're moving away from both reality and theory here, because the reality is that the United States has very polluted forms of climate, particularly, but of all kinds of.
We talked about that.
And second, the theory, let's go back to externalities. Externalities, is a sort of a sense of that capitalist markets are blind because the only criterion which determines whether an activity is viewed as of value and whether it should be continued is whether it's profitable. If it is producing environmental or
capitalism again, and that's not real. Capitalism in America, and in order to work, has to be restrained both by democratic governments, which represent people, and by moral standards.
Well, now you're moving toward a view of government, which
I'm saying this all along. No, I started with this. The point is there is no more such a thing as unfettered capitalism as there is communism. These are false constructs that are not commensurate to the best interests of people.
Well, maybe you and I would agree that on a kind of what you would call fettered capitalism, I would call restrained socialism. In other words, maybe you and I would find a common ground. Because you're talking about
the context of freedom. We don't need to have the nanny state to do
You
this.
just talked about regulation. You just talked about we need government.
I'm not an anarchist, but we don't need to have the bigger, more authoritarian nanny state type of socialism to do that. We can do it as free, sovereign citizens. Charles, we're reaching toward the end of the program because I don't want to tax people. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'd like to do more of it. It's tremendous. You're a great intellect, and I appreciate that. Why don't you take this opportunity, Charles, to let my listeners and the people who watch YouTube know where they can get your books, where they can find out more about you and your work.
Well, thank you for that. I would just tell people to go to that great corporation, Amazon, and find 20 books, all listed there, discounted and relatively easy to get. So we'll go back toward your capitalist distribution model. But I don't know, is Amazon a socialist organization or a capitalist organization?
It's a capitalist organization headed by a left-leaning guy. Okay. Anyways, as are most of these European countries you're talking about. Yeah. And by the way, my books are there on Amazon too. Okay. Charles, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's good to talk to you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.